Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to our fireside circle of mystery and murder most genteel. Tonight, we step into the hush of an old English manor on the last night of the year, where candlelight flickers against oak-panelled walls, where champagne glasses are raised in laughter, and where, somewhere beneath the merriment, an old grudge has been waiting patiently for its moment. This is Miss Marple and Death at the Manor's New Year. As the clock begins its slow climb toward midnight, and the fireworks gather in the darkened sky above the gardens, a guest among the revellers will draw his final breath, and no one, save one quiet lady with her knitting and her infinitely observant eyes, will understand quite why. Before we begin, do stay a while by the fire with us. Press that subscribe button so you never miss an evening such as this one. Now then, let us go in. The guests arrive. The village of Little Hadleigh lay hushed beneath a fine dusting of snow on the last afternoon of the old year, its cottages glowing amber at the windows, its single crooked lane leading up, past the church and the frozen duck pond, to the great iron gates of Hadleigh Manor. Miss Marple stood at those gates a little before 4 o'clock, her elderly companion Mrs. Ashworth-Grey, a stout, cheerful widow with a passion for other people's business, fussing at her elbow with an umbrella she did not need, for the snow had stopped an hour since. "Well, Jane," said Mrs. Ashworth-Grey, drawing her fur collar closer about her throat, "I must say I did not expect an invitation, not after all these years of the Fenwicks keeping so very much to themselves." "No," agreed Miss Marple placidly. "It is rather unusual, isn't it? But then, New Year's Eve does have a way of softening people. I imagine Lady Fenwick felt the house wanted filling, now that dear Sir Aldous is gone." She said this in her mild, knitting-needle sort of voice, the sort that gave away nothing at all of what she was truly thinking. And what she was thinking, as it happened, was that invitations extended after a long silence were very often not about softening at all, but about settling. The two ladies made their way up the drive, their boots crunching pleasantly on the gravel beneath the snow, and Hadleigh Manor rose before them in all its considerable, slightly shabby grandeur, a great grey house of many gables, its mullioned windows already lit for the evening, wreaths of holly hung upon the great oak door, and from within, the faint, cheerful strains of a gramophone playing a dance tune. It was Bassett, the Manor's elderly butler, who admitted them, his face arranged into the particular blend of dignity and weariness that Miss Marple associated with servants who have seen a great deal too much of a family to be surprised by anything they might do. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Ashworth-Grey, do come through. Her ladyship is in the drawing-room." The drawing-room, when they reached it, was already comfortably full. A great fire roared in the hearth, casting its light over dark oil portraits of Fenwicks long dead, and the room hummed with the particular bright, brittle gaiety of a house-party assembled for an occasion, rather than for pleasure, of one another's company. Lady Evelyn Fenwick came forward at once to greet them, a tall, handsome woman of perhaps 55, dressed in dove-grey silk with a single strand of pearls, her greying hair set in the immaculate waves that spoke of a lifetime's careful grooming. There was, Miss Marple noted, a certain brittleness about her smile, as of a woman holding herself together by main force of will. "Miss Marple, how very good of you to come, and at such short notice, too. I do hope you'll forgive the informality of it all. It occurred to me rather suddenly that the house had been too quiet for too long, and that it was high time we opened it up again, properly, the way Aldous would have wished." "How very thoughtful of you, Lady Fenwick," said Miss Marple, allowing her hand to be pressed. "And what a delightful gathering you've assembled." It was, Miss Marple privately considered as she was led further into the room, an interesting gathering indeed, for it was not, on the face of it, the sort of party one threw merely for gaiety's sake. There was too much design in it, too much of the feeling of a chessboard being carefully set. There was Gerald Fenwick, the son and heir, a fair, rather weak-chinned young man of 30 who stood by the fire with a glass in his hand and an expression of studied boredom that did not, Miss Marple thought, quite reach his eyes. Beside him, his wife Cynthia, a pretty, nervous young woman who kept glancing toward the door as though she expected, or perhaps dreaded, some particular arrival. There was Miss Priscilla Fenwick, Sir Aldous' unmarried sister, a spare, sharp-eyed woman of 60 in unfashionable black, who had, Mrs. Ashworth-Grey murmured under her breath, Never forgiven Evelyn for marrying Aldous in the first place, my dear. Not in 30 years, and I don't suppose she ever shall. There was Major Tom Redding, a bluff, weather-beaten man who had been, it seemed, a great friend of the late Sir Aldous, and who laughed a great deal too heartily at nothing in particular. And there was the local doctor, young Dr. Haverford, newly come to the practice, who had, so Mrs. Ashworth Grey informed her in the same undertone, taken quite a shine to little Miss Fenwick, the niece, though I understand it's not entirely encouraged in certain quarters. The niece in question, Miss Marple presently discovered, was a slim, dark-haired girl of perhaps 22 named Lucy Fenwick, who sat a little apart from the rest of the company near the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the door with the particular stillness of someone waiting for a thing she did not want to happen. It was into this stillness that, some 10 minutes later, Bassett appeared once more in the doorway and announced, in tones of the most perfect and practised neutrality, Colonel Ashby-Fenwick. The effect upon the room was immediate, and, to Miss Marple's quietly attentive eye, quite remarkable. Lady Fenwick's smile did not waver, but her hand, Miss Marple noticed, tightened almost imperceptibly upon the back of the nearest chair. Miss Priscilla Fenwick set down her sherry glass with rather more force than the action required. Gerald Fenwick's boredom vanished entirely, replaced by something harder and more watchful, and Lucy, by the window, went very white indeed. Colonel Rupert Ashby-Fenwick came into the room with the easy, faintly swaggering step of a man well used to making an entrance. He was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered still despite his years, with a weathered, handsome face and iron-grey hair swept back from a high forehead, and he wore his dinner jacket with the particular confidence of a man who had once cut a very fine figure indeed, and had not entirely noticed that the years had begun to take their toll. Evelyn. He took Lady Fenwick's hand and bowed over it with a courtliness that seemed, somehow, calculated rather than natural. "How very good of you to think of me, after all this time. I confess I hardly expected it." "Nonsense, Rupert," said Lady Fenwick, in a voice pitched perhaps a shade too brightly for the room. "It is New Year's Eve. One ought to let old differences lie with the old year, oughtn't one? Life is too short for grudges." "How very wise," said the Colonel, and smiled. A smile that did not, Miss Marple observed, extend itself to Miss Priscilla Fenwick, who was regarding him from across the room with an expression of such concentrated dislike that it was really quite remarkable she troubled to disguise it at all. Miss Marple, who had by now settled herself very comfortably into a wing chair near the fire with her knitting bag beside her, found herself observing the Colonel's progress about the room with the same quiet interest she might have brought to the arrival of a fox in a henhouse. He moved from guest to guest with practised charm, and yet, and this she noted particularly, his charm seemed to slide off each of them rather like water off a well-waxed table. Gerald was curt with him. Cynthia would not quite meet his eye. Miss Priscilla turned away from him entirely, on the pretext of ringing for more coal, though the fire, Miss Marple observed, was burning very well indeed. Only Lucy, when the Colonel finally made his way to her by the window, seemed to hold his gaze, and what passed between them, in that brief exchange of low voices which Miss Marple, straining her not inconsiderable powers of observation, could not quite overhear, left the girl looking, if anything, rather more frightened than before. "A family reunion, is it not delightful?" murmured Mrs. Ashworth Grey, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with the air of a woman thoroughly enjoying herself. "Though I must say, my dear, I had heard the Colonel and Sir Aldous parted on very bad terms indeed, some years back. Something about the old Ashby land. The boundary dispute, you understand, and a great deal of unpleasantness over money besides. I'm surprised Evelyn asked him at all." "Are you?" said Miss Marple, taking up her knitting. "How very interesting." She said it mildly enough, but her pale blue eyes, resting upon the handsome, self-satisfied figure of Colonel Ashby-Fenwick warming himself before the fire, held an expression that those who knew her well, and there were not many who did, truly, would have recognized at once. It was the expression of a woman who had lived a very great many years in a very small village, and who had learned, over the long accumulation of those years, that beneath every pleasant surface there generally lay something a good deal less pleasant indeed, and that grudges, like good wine, had a way of growing only stronger with age. Outside, the light was fading fast over the snow-covered gardens, and somewhere in the village below, the church clock struck the half-hour. 8 hours, Miss Marple reflected, dropping a stitch and picking it up again, without the least appearance of concern, until the old year gave way to the new. She rather thought it would prove a long evening. Old wounds, new smiles. By 9:30, the drawing-room had given way to the dining-room, and the dining-room, in turn, to a general drifting toward the long gallery, where a small orchestra of 3, piano, violin, and a rather enthusiastic percussionist, had been engaged from the nearby town to provide music for dancing. The candles had been lit in their silver sconces along the panelled walls, and the great gallery, hung with the accumulated portraits of 5 generations of Fenwicks, glowed warm and gold against the deepening dark outside. Miss Marple, who did not dance and had not the least intention of beginning now, had established herself in a comfortable chair near the tall windows at the gallery's far end, from which vantage point she commanded an excellent view of the proceedings, while appearing to do nothing more than knit and occasionally admire the fireworks that the head gardener's boys were, even now, setting up on the terrace below for the midnight display. It was, she reflected, a very useful sort of chair. "You are not dancing, Miss Marple." Dr. Haverford had detached himself from a group near the fire and come to stand beside her, his young face pleasant and a little anxious, as though he felt some duty to entertain the elderly guests. He was, Miss Marple thought, a nice young man, earnest, a little awkward, with the particular restlessness of someone whose attention was very much elsewhere in the room. "Oh no, Doctor, my dancing days are quite behind me, I'm afraid, though I do enjoy watching. It is such a pleasure to see young people enjoying themselves." She glanced, as if by chance, toward the far corner of the gallery, where Lucy Fenwick stood alone by a window, watching the dancers without any evident wish to join them. Miss Fenwick does not care for dancing either, it seems. Dr. Haverford's eyes followed her glance, and something in his face tightened. "Lucy, Miss Fenwick, has had rather a difficult day, I think," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man saying a great deal less than he knew. "Has she indeed? It is such a strain, is it not, these family gatherings? One is obliged to be pleasant to everyone, whatever one's private feelings. I always think it is rather hard on the young people especially. They have not yet learned the trick of it, the way we older folk have." "No," said Dr. Haverford, and there was something almost grim in the set of his young mouth, as he glanced once more across the room to where Colonel Ashby-Fenwick could be seen, glass in hand, in animated conversation with Major Redding by the fireplace. "No, I don't suppose she has." He excused himself shortly after, on the pretext of finding Lucy a glass of lemonade, and Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, allowed her gaze to travel once more, unhurried and apparently idle, about the gathering. It was Miss Priscilla Fenwick who provided the next small piece for what Miss Marple was already, quite privately, beginning to think of as her pattern, for Miss Priscilla, finding herself momentarily without occupation, had settled into the chair on Miss Marple's other side, with the evident intention of unburdening herself of a great deal of family history to a sympathetic and, more importantly, disinterested stranger. "You will forgive me for saying so, Miss Marple," she began, in the clipped, decided tones of a woman long accustomed to saying exactly what she thought, "but I consider this whole business of inviting Rupert here tonight to be a very great mistake. A very great mistake indeed. Do you, Miss Fenwick? I confess I know so little of the family history. Perhaps you would enlighten me." It was, Miss Marple had found over a very long life, remarkably easy to encourage a certain sort of person to talk, provided one asked in precisely the right tone of guileless interest, and Miss Priscilla Fenwick was very much that sort of person. "Rupert Ashby-Fenwick," said Miss Priscilla, with the particular relish of an old grievance long stored up and now, at last, given license to speak, "is my late brother's first cousin, and there was a time, many years ago, when the two of them were as close as brothers themselves. But there was a falling out, over the old Ashby land, the strip along the river that had been disputed between the two branches of the family since our grandfather's day, and Rupert, I may say, did not behave at all well over the matter. There were debts, you understand, gambling debts, and it was strongly suspected, though never proved, mind you, that certain documents relating to the boundary had gone missing from my brother's study at a time when Rupert was the only person besides ourselves who had access to it. Aldous never spoke to him again after that, not for 11 years, And now Evelyn goes and invites him to the house not 6 months after the funeral, as though 11 years of estrangement were nothing at all, as though poor Aldous' wishes counted for nothing now that he is not here to voice them. "How very distressing for you," murmured Miss Marple, her needles clicking steadily. "And does Colonel Ashby-Fenwick have other family connections here this evening? I could not help noticing that young Miss Lucy seemed rather troubled by his arrival." Something flickered across Miss Priscilla's sharp face, a hesitation, quickly suppressed. "Lucy is my late brother's ward, not his daughter, you understand. Her own parents died when she was small, and Aldous took her in. As for Rupert—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, and said only, in a rather different tone, "I really cannot say, Miss Marple. It is not my place to speculate on such matters." Which was, Miss Marple reflected, watching the older woman rise rather abruptly and move away toward the punch table, a very interesting sort of not answering, the kind that told one, in its way, a great deal more than a direct answer might have done. The evening wore on. The dancing grew livelier, the punch, dispensed liberally by Bassett and a hired footman, grew correspondingly more depleted, and Miss Marple, from her chair by the window, continued to observe, with the mild and apparently vague attention of an elderly lady more interested in her knitting than in her surroundings, the small currents and cross-currents that moved beneath the surface gaiety of the party. She observed Gerald Fenwick corner the Colonel near the drinks table shortly before 11, and though she could not hear what passed between them, she saw Gerald's face, ordinarily so carefully bored, flush an ugly red, and saw the Colonel's easy smile grow, if anything more pronounced. The smile, she thought, of a man rather enjoying another's discomfort. She observed Cynthia Fenwick watching this exchange from across the room with an expression of very real fear. She observed Major Redding drink a great deal more than was perhaps wise, and grow steadily louder and more sentimental in his reminiscences of dear old Aldous to anyone who would listen, until Lady Fenwick, with a tight, controlled smile, suggested he might care to step out onto the terrace for some air before the fireworks. And she observed, this perhaps most interesting of all, that at a little before 11:30, Colonel Ashby-Fenwick disappeared from the gallery altogether for the better part of 20 minutes, and that when he returned, he was noticeably paler than before, and dabbed once, quickly, at his brow with a pocket handkerchief, though the gallery, if anything, had grown rather cool with the doors thrown open to the terrace. "You are very quiet this evening, Jane," observed Mrs. Ashworth-Grey, arriving at her side with 2 glasses of the rather excellent champagne that had begun circulating in anticipation of midnight. "Whatever are you thinking about, tucked away here in your corner?" "Oh, nothing very much, my dear," said Miss Marple, accepting a glass with a smile. "Only that it is really remarkable, don't you think, how very much like a stage play these family gatherings can be, everyone playing their part so beautifully and smiling so nicely at one another, and all the while, underneath it all, she paused, considering her knitting with her head a little on one side. "Well, I dare say it is only my fancy. It has been a most delightful evening." Mrs. Ashworth-Grey, who was not by nature a particularly perceptive woman, laughed and moved away to find her husband, quite failing to notice that Miss Marple's pale eyes had not in fact left the door through which Colonel Ashby-Fenwick had just re-entered the gallery, nor the fact that Lucy Fenwick, from her place by the far window, was watching the same door with an expression of dread that had not lessened, in the whole course of the evening, by so much as a fraction. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady against the tall windows, and below, on the terrace, the gardener's boys could be seen making their final preparations among the rockets and Roman candles, their lanterns bobbing small and cheerful against the great dark bulk of the winter garden. The clock in the gallery, a handsome old thing in a walnut case, standing sentinel between 2 portraits of long-dead Fenwicks, showed 20 minutes to 12. Miss Marple, setting a stitch with great and deliberate care, thought that she had rarely attended a New Year's party that felt quite so very much like the moment before a held breath is finally released, the stroke of midnight. By 1:15 midnight, the whole party had drifted out onto the broad stone terrace at the back of the manor, wrapped in furs and greatcoats against the cold, glasses of champagne in gloved hands, breath rising in pale clouds against the black winter sky. Below the terrace, the gardens fell away in white, moonlit tiers toward the frozen lake, and beyond them, The dark shapes of the fireworks stood ready upon their stakes. The gardener's boys crouched nearby with their lanterns, waiting for the signal. Miss Marple, well wrapped in a heavy shawl over her black dress, and quite content to observe rather than participate, had secured for herself a most excellent position near the terrace balustrade, from which she could see both the assembled company and, beyond them, through the tall windows, the lit gallery and the great walnut clock that would, in a very few minutes now, strike the hour. 10 minutes to go, announced Gerald Fenwick, consulting his watch with the slightly exaggerated importance of a man glad of something official to do. Bassett is bringing out the champagne for the toast. There was a general murmur of pleasurable anticipation. Lady Fenwick, moving among her guests with the practised grace of a hostess, determined that nothing should be seen to be amiss, paused beside Miss Marple with a warm smile that did not, Miss Marple noted, quite banish the strain about her eyes. "I do hope you're not too cold, Miss Marple. We shall go in again directly after the fireworks. I've asked for hot punch to be ready." "How very thoughtful, Lady Fenwick. I am enjoying myself enormously. It is such a treat to see the whole family together like this." Something passed, swift and unreadable, across Lady Fenwick's handsome face, there and gone again before Miss Marple could quite name it. And then she moved on, toward where Colonel Ashby-Fenwick stood a little apart from the others, near the terrace steps, his glass untouched in his hand, staring out over the dark garden with an expression that was, for once, entirely without its habitual charm. He looked, Miss Marple thought, watching him with quiet attention over the top of her knitting, like a man waiting for something he both wanted and dreaded in equal measure. "Rupert," Lady Fenwick's voice, low, reached Miss Marple faintly on the still air. "You will stay for the toast, at least." "I shall stay for the toast, Evelyn," said the Colonel, not turning. "I did not come all this way to slip off before midnight." Whatever else might have passed between them was lost, for at that moment Bassett appeared with the champagne, and there was a general cheerful surge toward the trays, a chorus of voices, the pop and fizz of corks drawn in quick succession. Miss Marple accepted a glass from the tray with a murmur of thanks, and noted, with the same idle-seeming attention she brought to everything, that Colonel Ashby-Fenwick took his own glass from Bassett's tray along with everyone else, and that Gerald Fenwick, passing near him a moment later, with rather too much studied casualness, said something low that made the Colonel's mouth tighten before he turned away toward the balustrade. 5 minutes, called Major Redding, a little unsteadily, from somewhere near the steps, and there was a fresh ripple of laughter and the small bustle of people arranging themselves to face the dark gardens and the waiting fireworks. Miss Marple found herself, quite naturally, standing near enough to the Colonel to observe him without appearing to do so, a skill she had perfected over the better part of 80 years of English village life, where the appearance of not watching one's neighbours was every bit as important as the watching itself. He was, she thought, a man under some very considerable strain. He had set down his champagne glass, scarcely touched, upon the stone balustrade, and taken out his cigarette case, and his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady as he struck the match. "A cold night for it," she said pleasantly, drawing a little nearer. He glanced at her, really looked at her, she thought, for the first time that evening, as though noticing her presence properly for the first time, and something in his weathered face softened, unexpectedly, into something almost gentle. Cold, yes. He drew on his cigarette. "Though I find I don't feel it much. One's thoughts have a way of crowding out the weather on a night like this." "Old memories, Colonel?" "Something of the sort." He smiled, a real smile this time, tired and a little rueful, quite unlike the practised charm he had shown the room all evening. "You know Miss Marple, is it? I came here tonight meaning to set a great many things right. I find it is a good deal harder than I had imagined it would be." "It generally is," said Miss Marple gently, "the setting right of old wrongs. But I think it is very much worth attempting, all the same, whatever the difficulty." He looked at her a moment longer, as though he might have said something further, and then Gerald's voice rang out, 1 minute, and the moment passed. The Colonel turned back toward the gardens, picking up his champagne glass once more from the balustrade, and Miss Marple, retreating a step, resumed her place beside Mrs. Ashworth Grey, who had appeared at her elbow in a fresh cloud of scent and enthusiasm. "Isn't this exciting, Jane? I do love a good New Year. 30 seconds now, I think." The great clock in the gallery, visible through the tall windows behind them, began, with stately deliberation, to strike the hour. 1, 2, 3. The whole party had turned, as one, to face the dark gardens, glasses raised, voices lifting already, in ragged anticipation of the cheer to come. Miss Marple, raising her own glass along with the rest, found her eyes drawn, almost without her willing it, back to Colonel Ashby-Fenwick, who stood a little apart from the others near the balustrade, glass lifted, his face turned up toward the sky where, on the 8th stroke, the first of the rockets went up in a great soaring arc of gold. 6, 7, 8. The rocket burst overhead in a shower of falling light, gold and then green, and the terrace rang with cheering and the clink of glasses. "Happy New Year! Happy New Year!" called out from a dozen throats at once, and somewhere Major Redding began, uncertainly, the opening bars of Auld Lang Syne. 9, 10. It was Cynthia Fenwick who saw it first. A small, sharp cry, cut off almost as soon as it began, and then Rupert, and the sound, dreadful and unmistakable even amid the noise and the falling light of the fireworks, of a glass shattering on the stone flags. 11, 12. The last stroke of midnight died away into a silence that seemed, for one terrible suspended moment, to swallow up even the crackle and hiss of the fireworks still bursting overhead. For Colonel Rupert Ashby-Fenwick had fallen, quite without warning, against the stone balustrade, one hand clutched convulsively to his chest, his face, in the cold white light of the falling rocket stars, contorted with a sudden and terrible pain. "Rupert!" Lady Fenwick's voice, high and cracked with horror, cut across the dying cheers as she pushed her way toward him. "Rupert, what is it?" He tried to speak. Miss Marple, moving forward with a speed that would have surprised anyone who thought her merely a frail old lady fond of her knitting, was near enough to see his lips form what might have been a word, though no sound came, before his knees buckled beneath him, and he went down hard upon the frost-white stones of the terrace, quite still among the scattered fragments of his own champagne glass, while overhead the last of the fireworks burst and faded, gold and green and gold again, into the indifferent dark. "Dr. Haverford!" Lady Fenwick's scream, this time, carried the whole length of the terrace. "For God's sake, someone fetch Dr. Haverford!" But Miss Marple, kneeling with some difficulty upon the cold stone beside the fallen man, one gloved hand already at his wrist where no pulse now stirred, understood, with the particular calm certainty that came to her, always, in such moments, quite apart from any horror or distress she might otherwise have felt, that it was already very much too late, and that whatever secret Colonel Ashby-Fenwick had come to Hadleigh Manor that night to set right, he had carried it with him, in the end, into the new year and beyond it, unspoken. The old year had died, as old years do, at the stroke of midnight. It was not, however, the only death the manor would mark that night. A shattered glass. For a long, terrible moment, nobody on the terrace moved at all. Then everything happened at once. Dr. Haverford, white-faced, pushed through the small crowd that had gathered and dropped to his knees on the colonel's other side, his fingers going swiftly to the throat, to the wrist, his young face already grim with a knowledge he did not yet wish to voice aloud. Lady Fenwick had gone quite rigid, one hand pressed hard against her mouth. Cynthia Fenwick was sobbing, half hysterically, against her husband's shoulder, while Gerald himself stood very still, staring down at the fallen colonel, with an expression Miss Marple found she could not, for the moment, quite read. Miss Priscilla Fenwick had not moved from where she stood, some 10 feet distant, her sharp face oddly blank, and Lucy Fenwick, stood quite alone at the edge of the terrace, both hands pressed to her white cheeks, making no sound at all. "Everyone stand back, please." Dr. Haverford's voice, when it came, was steadier than his face had suggested it might be. "Give him air. Bassett, send for the police, at once. And telephone for Dr. Meacham as well. I shall want a second opinion. No, wait." He stopped himself, his hand still at the colonel's throat, and something in his stillness communicated itself to the gathered company more effectively than any words could have done. "He's dead," said Major Redding, in a voice from which all trace of drunken sentimentality had been abruptly and completely burned away. "Good God, he's dead." "I am afraid so," said Dr. Haverford quietly. He sat back on his heels, looking, for a moment, very young indeed, and very much out of his depth. "I am afraid he is quite dead." It was Miss Marple, still kneeling with more discomfort than she cared to admit, upon the freezing stone, who asked, in her mild, unhurried voice, the question that seemed to hover, unspoken and dreadful, over the whole shocked assembly. "Was it his heart, Doctor, do you think? He did seem to me, earlier this evening, to be under a very great strain." Dr. Haverford glanced at her, a quick, assessing glance, the sort a careful man gives when deciding how much to say and to whom. And then, perhaps because there seemed no very obvious reason not to, he answered her. "It may have been his heart. I understand he had complained of some trouble in that direction in recent years, but I confess," he hesitated, looking down once more at the Colonel's contorted face, at the rigid set of the jaw, the peculiar bluish tinge already visible about the lips. "I confess it does not entirely look to me like a simple heart seizure. I should like to examine him properly before I say more. In the meantime, I think it best that nothing here be disturbed, and that the police be sent for without delay." The word police fell upon the terrace like a stone into still water, and Miss Marple, watching the ripples it produced upon each face in turn, found herself cataloguing them with the same careful attention she might once have given to the arrangement of flowers for a church fete. Lady Fenwick's horror, she thought, was quite genuine, and yet threaded through with something else, something that might almost have been called relief, quickly and guiltily suppressed. Gerald's stillness had given way to a kind of held, watchful tension. Miss Priscilla's blankness had not shifted at all, which was, in its way, the most curious reaction of the lot. And Lucy had begun, very quietly, to cry. It was Bassett, dispatched to telephone, who returned some minutes later with the information that the local constable, a Sergeant Biggins, was already on his way up from the village, having been alerted by the sound of raised voices carrying across the still winter air, and that Inspector Crandall of the county force had likewise been notified and would follow directly. In the confusion that followed, the moving of the body, with such gentleness as the circumstances allowed, to the small morning room off the terrace, the shepherding of the shocked and shivering guests back into the warmth of the gallery, the low, urgent conferences between Dr. Haverford and Bassett regarding what should and should not be touched, Miss Marple found herself, quite naturally and without any particular effort on her own part, largely overlooked. This suited her very well indeed, for it permitted her to observe, from her accustomed chair by the window, a great deal that might otherwise have escaped her notice entirely. She observed, for instance, that Colonel Ashby-Fenwick's champagne glass, the one he had lifted at the stroke of midnight, lay shattered upon the terrace flags precisely where he had dropped it, and that Dr. Haverford, before permitting anyone else to approach, had knelt, and with a handkerchief wrapped carefully about his fingers, gathered up the largest fragments and set them aside upon a stone urn, well away from the general traffic of feet. She observed that Gerald Fenwick, in the general movement back toward the house, contrived to pass close by that same stone urn, and that his eyes rested upon the gathered fragments of glass for a moment longer than idle curiosity alone might have accounted for. She observed that Lucy Fenwick, when Dr. Haverford came to her, gently as one might approach a frightened animal, and asked whether she was quite well, flinched from his touch as though it burned her, and then, seeing his hurt surprise, caught his hand in both of hers with a sudden, desperate grip, and whispered something to him that made the young doctor's face go, if possible, even paler than before. And she observed, perhaps most tellingly of all, that Lady Fenwick, moving among her stricken guests with the automatic, well-trained grace of a woman who had spent 30 years as a hostess and could not entirely abandon the habit even now, paused once, very briefly, beside the morning-room door where the Colonel's body had been laid, and stood there a moment with her hand pressed flat against the panelling, her head bowed, in an attitude that might have been grief or prayer or something else again that Miss Marple, for all her long experience of human nature, could not immediately put a name to. Sergeant Biggins arrived within the half-hour, a large, red-faced, deliberate man, clearly rather overwhelmed by the magnitude of the occasion that had been thrust upon him on this of all nights, and considerably relieved when, some 40 minutes later, the crunch of tyres upon the snowy drive announced the arrival of Inspector Crandall from the county headquarters. Inspector Crandall proved to be a lean, grey-eyed man of perhaps 45, with the quiet, watchful manner of someone long accustomed to walking into rooms full of frightened and unhappy people and making sense of what he found there. He listened to Dr. Haverford's account with close attention, examined the body with a swift, practiced thoroughness, and then, straightening, said, in a voice pitched to carry no further than the small group immediately around him, "I think, Doctor, that we had better not speak further of hearts just yet. I should like the fragments of that glass sent to the laboratory at once, and I should like a list, if you please, of everyone present on this terrace at midnight, and of anyone who had occasion, this evening, to be alone with the deceased, however briefly." It was, Miss Marple reflected, watching this exchange from her chair, with her knitting once more busy in her lap, precisely the sort of statement that transformed a house full of grieving, shocked guests into a house full of suspects, and she thought, not for the first time that evening, of the strange, still figure of Lucy Fenwick, standing alone at the terrace's edge, while all about her the fireworks fell in showers of dying gold, and of the word, unspoken but somehow present in every frightened glance exchanged about the room, that hung now over Hadleigh Manor as surely as the smoke of the spent rockets still hung, thin and acrid, above the silent, snow-white gardens. Murder. It was well past 1 o'clock before Inspector Crandall, having established that no one was to leave the house that night, turned his attention, almost as an afterthought, for she had said nothing at all throughout the whole of his brisk questioning of the assembled company, to the small, elderly lady, seated quietly by the window with her knitting. "And you are, madam, Jane Marple, Inspector. I am a guest of Lady Fenwick's, quite an unexpected one, I confess, as I understand are several of us here tonight." She smiled at him, mild and faintly apologetic, over the top of her spectacles. "I don't suppose I can be of very much help to you. I am really nothing more than a foolish old woman who enjoys her knitting and her garden, and I fear I did not see anything at all remarkable this evening, beyond perhaps one or two very small and probably quite unimportant things." Inspector Crandall, who had encountered a very great many witnesses in the course of his career, and had learned to place no great weight upon their own assessment of their usefulness, regarded her for a moment with those steady grey eyes, and something in his tired, watchful face relaxed, very slightly, into what might almost have been the beginning of interest. "Small things are very often the most useful sort, Miss Marple," he said. "I wonder if you would be good enough to tell me what they were." "Threads in the snow." "Well," said Miss Marple, setting down her knitting, with the air of a woman about to say a great deal less than she actually knew, "I hardly know where to begin, Inspector, for I am really quite unused to this sort of thing. But I did notice, and I dare say it is nothing at all, that Colonel Ashby-Fenwick left the gallery for a considerable time shortly before 11:30, and that when he returned, he seemed a good deal paler than when he had left, and dabbed at his forehead with his handkerchief, though the room was not at all warm by then, the doors having been standing open to the terrace for some time." Inspector Crandall had produced a small notebook, and was writing in it with a stub of pencil. 20 minutes, would you say, Miss Marple? Half an hour? I should say nearer 20, Inspector, though I confess I did not consult my watch at the time. One doesn't, does one, at a party? And do you know where he went during that time? I'm afraid I do not, but perhaps Bassett might know. Servants generally do know these things, though they are not always at liberty to say so. She resumed her knitting, needles clicking placidly. There is also the matter of the champagne glasses, Inspector, though I expect you have already thought of that. Go on. Only that Bassett distributed the glasses from a tray, quite openly, to everyone assembled on the terrace, some minutes before midnight, and that the Colonel set his own glass down upon the balustrade for a little while, when he stepped aside to smoke a cigarette, before taking it up again just before the toast. It occurs to me that a glass left unattended upon a balustrade, in the general bustle and confusion of a party, might very easily have been tampered with, shall we say, by anyone who happened to be standing near it at the time, and that no one at all would have thought it in the least remarkable, for people are forever setting down their glasses and picking up the wrong one, or the right one with something added to it, at parties of this kind. I remember a most distressing incident at the Hartnell Wicks's garden party some years ago, when poor Colonel Hartnell very nearly drank a glass of barley water that had been left out quite by accident for the vicar's little dog, who suffered dreadfully from indigestion and was kept to a most particular diet. "I beg your pardon, I do run on. The point I meant to make, Inspector, is only that several people were standing quite near that balustrade in the minutes before midnight, and any one of them might have had the opportunity, however briefly." "And who, Miss Marple, was standing near it?" Miss Marple appeared to consider this with great care, counting, perhaps, stitches upon her needle. Mr. Gerald Fenwick passed close by the Colonel not 5 minutes before the toast, and said something to him that appeared to distress the Colonel a good deal. His colour changed quite markedly. I could not hear what was said, I'm sorry to say. And Major Redding was standing not far off as well, though I believe he was rather occupied with his own champagne by that time. And Lady Fenwick spoke with the Colonel briefly, just before the fireworks began. She paused. "And I myself stood near him for a little while, Inspector, so I suppose I must be a suspect too, must I not?" Inspector Crandall's mouth twitched very slightly at one corner. "I think we may set you aside for the present, Miss Marple. Was there anyone else?" "There was Miss Lucy Fenwick," said Miss Marple, more slowly now, and something in her voice made the inspector look up sharply from his notebook. Though she did not go near the balustrade, so far as I observed, she stood apart from the others the whole evening, poor child, and looked, I thought, very frightened indeed, from the moment the Colonel arrived, in fact, and not merely after his death. I wonder, Inspector, whether you have yet had the opportunity of speaking with her." "Not yet. Dr. Haverford tells me she is very much distressed and asked that she be permitted to rest before being questioned further." "How very solicitous of Dr. Haverford," murmured Miss Marple, in a tone that conveyed, without stating anything so indelicate as a fact, a very great deal of meaning indeed. It was Sergeant Biggins, dispatched to make preliminary inquiries below stairs while the inspector conducted his interviews above, who returned within the hour with a piece of information that changed the whole complexion of the case, and which Miss Marple, established once more in her chair by the gallery window, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting while the household was interviewed, one by one, in the small library across the hall, received with no very great surprise at all. "Arsenic, sir," Biggins reported, low-voiced to the inspector, though not so low that Miss Marple's excellent hearing failed to catch the word entire. "Dr. Meacham's had a preliminary look and says the symptoms are consistent, right enough. And Bassett's found a tin of the stuff missing from the gardener's shed, where it's kept for the rats. Been there above a year, by the dust on the shelf where it stood. Accessible to anyone in the household then," said Crandall. "Anyone who knew where to look, sir, which is most of them, I should think, having lived here or visited regular for years." Miss Marple, her needles pausing for the briefest of moments, reflected that this was precisely the sort of fact that widened a case rather than narrowed it, and that Inspector Crandall would now have before him not one obvious suspect, but half a dozen, each with motive enough, on the evidence already gathered, to have wished the Colonel dead. The interviews proceeded through the small hours, and though Miss Marple was not, of course, present at any of them, she found, as she generally did in houses of this kind, that a great deal of information travelled quite freely along the servants' corridors and found its way, eventually, to any ear patient enough to listen for it. Mrs. Ashworth Grey, thoroughly enjoying the whole dreadful business now that the first shock had passed, proved a most willing conduit. "They say Gerald owed the Colonel a very great deal of money, my dear. Gambling debts run up in town, and the Colonel had been pressing him for repayment for months, threatening to go to Lady Fenwick about it, if Gerald didn't settle by the new year. That would explain the words on the terrace, wouldn't it?" "It would indeed," said Miss Marple. "And Miss Priscilla, well, everyone knows she never forgave Rupert for the business over the land, all those years ago, and I have heard, though I cannot say how true it is, that Sir Aldous left a letter, when he died, naming Rupert as the one who took those missing boundary papers, and that Priscilla found it among his effects, and has kept it against him ever since, only she could never prove anything from it in law." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, "how very unfortunate for everybody." "And as for Lucy," Mrs. Ashworth Grey lowered her voice further still, glancing about the empty gallery with evident relish. "I heard from the upstairs maid that Lucy went to the Colonel's room herself, before dinner, and that there was a most dreadful scene, crying and raised voices, though no one could make out the words through the door. And Dr. Haverford was seen going up that same corridor, not 10 minutes after her, looking like thunder, Miss Marple set down her knitting altogether and folded her hands upon it, gazing out through the tall, dark window at the snow, which had begun to fall once more, softly, upon the sleeping gardens where, some hours before, a man had lifted his glass to a new year he was not, in the end, to see. She thought of Colonel Ashby-Fenwick's face as he had spoken to her on the terrace. "I came here tonight, meaning to set a great many things right," and of the peculiar, weary sincerity with which he had said it. She thought of Lucy's white, frightened face, and of the way the girl had looked at the Colonel across the room, that first evening, with an expression that was not, Miss Marple was now quite certain, merely dislike, nor merely fear, but something more complicated than either, something that reminded her, in fact, very strongly indeed, of a certain unhappy business involving young Ted Gaskell and old Miss Trenchard's companion, some 15 years back in St. Mary Mead, which had also begun with a girl's tears behind a closed door and ended in a way nobody in the village had ever quite expected. "Mrs. Ashworth Grey," she said slowly, "I wonder, did anyone mention what time, precisely, Miss Lucy went up to see the Colonel before dinner?" "6:30, I believe, my dear. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple, though her pale blue eyes, resting once more upon the softly falling snow beyond the window, held an expression that suggested she had, in fact, a very particular reason indeed, one that had, in the last few minutes, begun to arrange itself in her mind with the same quiet, inexorable clarity with which a dropped stitch, once found, can be traced back along the whole length of the row to discover precisely where the pattern first went wrong. She thought she should very much like to speak with Miss Lucy Fenwick herself, before the night was very much older. What the new year uncovered. Miss Marple found Lucy Fenwick a little before 3 in the morning, in the small sitting room adjoining her bedchamber, where the girl sat curled in a window seat, still in her evening gown, watching the snow fall over the dark garden with the fixed, unseeing stare of someone who has cried until there are no tears left to cry. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, closing the door behind her, "I wonder if you would permit an old woman to sit with you a while. I find I cannot sleep after such a dreadful evening, and I thought perhaps neither could you." Lucy looked up, startled, and made as if to compose herself into the polite mask she had worn all evening, and then, quite suddenly, the mask crumpled, and she said, in a small, cracked voice, "They think I did it. I can see it in their faces." Inspector Crandall asked me such questions, where I went and when, and what the Colonel said to me before dinner, and I couldn't tell him, I couldn't tell any of them, and now they will think whatever the evidence leads them to think, my dear, which is why it is generally so very much wiser to tell the truth than to let silence do the work of guilt for you. Miss Marple settled herself into the chair opposite with the unhurried calm of a woman who had, in her time, coaxed a very great many frightened young people into saying things they had believed themselves incapable of saying. "I think, you know, that Colonel Ashby-Fenwick was not a stranger to you at all, whatever the family may have given out. I think he came here tonight to tell you something rather important, something about who you truly are." Lucy stared at her for a long moment, and then, all at once, the whole unhappy story came pouring out, as such stories generally do once the first stone in the dam has been dislodged. Her mother, it seemed, had not died when Lucy was small, as the family had always told her. Her mother had been Colonel Ashby-Fenwick's own younger sister, dead in truth these many years, but her father had never been the anonymous, poor young man, gone before you were born, of family legend. Her father had been Rupert Ashby-Fenwick himself, born out of wedlock during the very years of his estrangement from Sir Aldous, and given quietly into the Fenwick household to be raised as a ward rather than acknowledged. A bargain struck, long ago, between the Colonel and his cousin, in the last civil conversation the two men had ever had, in exchange for the Colonel's silence over certain other matters concerning the family land. "He came to my room before dinner to tell me the truth of it at last," Lucy said, twisting her handkerchief between her fingers. "He said he had come to make everything right, that he meant to acknowledge me publicly, whatever the scandal, and that he had brought papers with him tonight to prove it, and to settle a proper inheritance on me besides, quite apart from anything the Fenwicks might choose to leave me. I didn't know whether to be glad or terrified. I have called Aldous uncle my whole life, and now, all in a moment, I was to become someone else's daughter entirely, and a stranger's besides. I was crying because I didn't know what I felt, Miss Marple, not because I meant him harm. I could never have meant him harm. He was the first person in this house, in all my life, who ever wanted nothing from me at all, except to say he was sorry. I believe you, my dear, said Miss Marple, and found, a little to her own surprise, that her old eyes had grown rather warm. I believe you entirely, and I think, if you will trust an old woman a little further, that you had much better tell the inspector exactly what you have told me, papers and all, for I think those papers, wherever the colonel had them about him tonight, may prove to be a very great deal more important than either of us yet knows. It was, in fact, precisely this small, apparently peripheral detail, the matter of the papers, that resolved itself, some 20 minutes later, into the final and decisive piece of Miss Marple's pattern. For a search of the colonel's room, conducted at her quiet suggestion by Inspector Crandall, produced a sealed envelope in the dead man's own hand, addressed to Lady Fenwick, containing not only a full account of Lucy's true parentage, but a second document besides, a faded letter, dated some 11 years back, in the unmistakable hand of the late Sir Aldous Fenwick, and addressed to his solicitor, in which he confessed, with what appeared to be considerable and belated remorse, to having forged the boundary papers himself, all those years ago, in order to cheat his cousin Rupert of the disputed Ashby land, the very crime for which Rupert had been blamed, and banished from the family for over a decade. He kept it, Inspector Crandall said slowly, turning the old letter over in his hands as the small library filled, once more, with the assembled and now thoroughly exhausted household. Ashby-Fenwick kept his cousin's confession all these years, and never used it, until tonight, it seems, when he meant to bring it out at last and clear his own name, publicly, before the whole family. Which would also, said Miss Marple from her chair in the corner, in the mild, apologetic voice of someone rather sorry to be the bearer of unwelcome logic, have meant blackening the name of the late Sir Aldous, quite thoroughly and quite publicly, on the very night his family had gathered to remember him. I imagine that would have been a very great blow indeed to anyone who had spent the last year of her life defending her brother's memory against every breath of scandal that came near it. The silence that followed this observation had a different quality from any that had preceded it that night, a stillness that seemed to gather itself inexorably around the upright, black-clad figure of Miss Priscilla Fenwick, who had not moved nor spoken since the reading of her brother's letter. Miss Fenwick, said Inspector Crandall quietly, I think you had better tell us where you were between 11:30 and midnight. I have already told you, said Miss Priscilla, and her voice, Miss Marple noted, though she strove to keep it level, had lost a good deal of its earlier crispness. I was in the gallery, with the other guests. You were seen, said Miss Marple gently, to leave the gallery for the gardener's shed, a little before 11:30, Miss Fenwick. I believe to fetch more coal, though I could not help noticing, when I glanced out of the window some minutes later, that you returned by way of the terrace rather than the coal store, and that the colonel's glass stood quite alone and unattended upon the balustrade at just that time, while he had stepped aside to smoke his cigarette. It is really remarkable, is it not, how very much can happen in the space of 2 or 3 minutes, at a party, when everyone's attention is fixed upon the fireworks and the coming midnight, and no one at all is watching an old lady with a coal scuttle. Miss Priscilla Fenwick's composure, held so rigidly in place through the whole long night, broke at last, not into tears, but into something harder and more terrible, a kind of bleak, exhausted defiance that seemed, in its way, more honest than anything she had said before. He was going to destroy Aldous' memory, she said, and her voice shook now, though whether with grief or anger, Miss Marple could not entirely have said. 11 years I defended my brother against every whisper of that old scandal. 11 years I told myself, and everyone else, that Rupert had been the thief, that Aldous had done no wrong, and I believed it, God help me, I believed it utterly, because Aldous told me it was so, and I loved him, and I could not conceive that he would lie to his own sister. And then Rupert comes back into this house smiling, forgiven by Evelyn as though 11 years were nothing, and I understood at once from the way he looked at me, that he had come to prove, once and for all, that it was Aldous who lied, Aldous who forged those papers, Aldous who let his own cousin carry the blame for a crime he did not commit. I could not let him do it. I could not let my brother's name be dragged through the mud on the very night his own family gathered to remember him. Not for Rupert's sake, not for anyone's. I found the arsenic in the shed weeks ago, when I went looking for something to deal with the mice in the linen room, and I do not know, even now, quite when I decided. Only that when I saw his glass standing there alone upon the balustrade, with everyone's eyes turned toward the fireworks, it seemed, God forgive me, so very easy a thing to do. There was a long silence in the small library, broken only by the soft crackle of the dying fire, and, somewhere beyond the tall windows, the first grey intimation of a winter dawn beginning to touch the sky above the snow-covered gardens. "An old grudge," said Miss Marple at last, very quietly, almost to herself, "does not die simply because a year turns over, does it? It waits, very patiently, for its moment, and I am afraid, Miss Fenwick, that moments of that kind have a way of arriving at the very time we least wish them to." It was Inspector Crandall who saw Miss Marple to her room, some while later, as the household began at last to disperse into the exhausted, unreal hours of the morning after, and it was Inspector Crandall who paused at her door to say, with the slightly rueful respect of a man who had learned, over the course of one very long night, not to underestimate elderly ladies with knitting bags, "I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, I had my eye on young Lucy Fenwick for the better part of the evening, and on Gerald besides, for his debts. I don't know that I should have got to Miss Priscilla at all, left to my own devices." "Oh, I don't think that's quite true, Inspector," said Miss Marple kindly, for she was, beneath the mildness, a scrupulously fair-minded woman, and disliked to take credit that was not entirely her own. "You had all the same facts I had. I think perhaps it is only that I have lived so very long in a small village, where one learns that the people who protest the loudest, they have nothing to say, are generally the ones who have the most to hide, and that grief, when it curdles into grievance, can make quite as ruthless a murderer as greed or fear ever did. It is not a comfortable thing to know about one's fellow creatures, but there it is." She bade him good night, and let herself into her room, where Mrs. Ashworth Grey was already deeply and blessedly asleep in the adjoining bed, and Miss Marple, drawing back the curtain a little way to look out over the white, silent gardens where, some hours before, a man had lifted his glass to a future he was never to see, thought of Lucy Fenwick's tears, and of Priscilla Fenwick's 11 years of grief, twisted slowly, patiently, into something else entirely. And thought, too, that whatever fine resolutions people made at the turning of the year, however brightly the fireworks burned, however loudly the bells rang in the new beginning, the old grudges of the world had a way of persisting all the same, quiet and unweeded, beneath the snow, waiting only for their season to come round again. It had, she reflected, dropping her needles at last into her work-bag and settling wearily into bed, been rather a longer evening than she had anticipated. Outside, the first pale light of the new year was beginning, very slowly, to climb over the sleeping hills of little Hadleigh.